Welcome to the next episode of the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization podcast, and we've been finishing up this long series on the Council of Nicaea with PJ from the Global Church History Project, and then we're about to launch into another long series looking at the theology of the human body, and I've already recorded some of those episodes, and it gets pretty intense looking at the meaning from a biblical perspective of parts of the human head and then the human body and organs and things. I hope everyone will enjoy that series. But before we do that, we kind of wanted to partly pay tribute to all the work that PJ does with the Global Church History Project, which and ask him to share about a couple of great figures from church history. When we were thinking about this, we were kind of overwhelmed because he literally has hundreds of them that he's researched and written on. And every day with the Global Church History Project, they produce, most people only ever see the little bits that are shared on Facebook, which is usually a couple of paragraphs and a prayer. But from others of us, we know that there's usually kind of like an essay on each of these characters that are shared. And immense research is put into those. And we'll ask him a little bit more about that later as we go. But we've picked two characters, and we're going to ask PJ to take us deeper into them, beyond the couple of paragraphs that we may have seen on Facebook or whatever. And the first one we'll look at is Gaudí. Now, this is a Spanish person, and he's like part of the contemporary modern world, 20th century figure. He's, what's his full name?
So he's the Venerable. He just got venerated this year, so it's a big...
Does that mean he's officially a saint?
He's on the process. Yeah.
He's on the conveyor belt, heading towards official sainthood. Now, of course, from a Protestant point of view, all Christians are saints, and of course, everyone knows that. Every Christian is a saint. But with that process, what they're doing is they're saying, okay, that may be true, but there's certain people who are so manifestly, obviously model Christians, and then the Catholic Church does this, and Orthodox do it in different ways. But it's a way of saying, now here are some people who we wish to hold up as model Christians. So this has happened for this guy recently, and he's on this process of being elevated in that way.
And you give it a bit of time, so there's no secrets are going to come out. Like we've had some of these controversies
that's true.
about,
There's plenty of living Christians at the moment, and we don't need to wait till they're dead for all the skeletons to come out. There's an absolute army of skeletons coming out of closets for a lot of people who are supposed to be Christians around at the moment. Anyway, leaving that aside, Gaudí is not such a person. Now then, I thought, what are his dates? He was born in the 19th century?
Yeah, 1852.
1852, and he lived right through till...
the 1926.
1926, so it's that sort of 75-year period sort of time. Now then, he, as far as I was aware, he was an atheist, but he's famous. If people know, they maybe don't know a lot about him, but they do know his work. What is it that he's famous for?
The thing he's most famous for is the Basilica of the Holy Family, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Although he's done loads of things all around the city and in other places in the world. He actually designed a skyscraper in New York that hasn't been built yet, but hopefully one day it will. But yeah, that's his most famous thing, is this basilica, like a presentation of the gospel in architectural form right in the middle of the city.
So it's interesting that we think about that, because of course this is invented by God, like the living God, going right back to when there was the tabernacle, which was a sort of temporary structure that embodied a model of the universe filled with theological truth. And the idea was for people to come, see it, meditate on it, and be drawn deep into theological knowledge and encounter with Jesus Christ through a building. And then later, when that building is put into brick form, David wanted to do it, but because he was a man of violence. And that's interesting that the Lord has this, the Bible has this kind of view that sometimes violence was necessary, but the Lord kind of thinks there's no future to that. That's not how we're going to do things forever. So David's not allowed to be part of this architectural work, and it has to be handed over to Solomon, who doesn't do any warfare or anything. But he builds this incredible building, which is this embodiment again of theology, a vision of the universe, a vision of Jesus. So all of that way of thinking that a building can embody the most profound theological truths, and then that happens at different times in different cathedrals and works throughout history. And this one might be the most famous example of this in the modern age for Europeans anyway. So tell us about this. Here's the guy, it does this, people go and see it. It's often when people say, oh, you're going to Barcelona, they either say, are you going to see the football team or are you going to see the cathedral? Those are the two things that tourists go to Barcelona for. So he's right up there with the football team in terms of fame for tourists. What is it about this building then? What was he... Because I don't think he was a Christian. Like, I didn't think he was a Christian when he started this anyway. So what was he trying to do? And what was the point of such this vision is so extraordinary. Tell us about this cathedral and his journey with it.
Yeah, so he was like a far left kind of communist, atheist, anti-clerical agitator sort of guy when he was at uni. And so we got very embroiled in this modernist movement of architecture. But in Barcelona, or the Catalan regions in particular, that had a different kind of form where it was all about appreciating nature. And his mum was very pious, and he was named after his mum, Antonia. And she would always make sure, because he was very sickly as a kid, she always made sure he did lots of walks in nature and read lots of Bible to him. So he had this appreciation for nature, and he had lots of knowledge about the Bible, even if he didn't believe it as a student. So he is all about this, about getting all the latest technology and making it make natural stuff that appears in nature in architecture. So lots of like fish and waves and that sort of stuff you can see. And loads of the stuff is still around in Barcelona. You can go in loads of different places and you'll find little bits that Gaudí's done of this weird sort of stuff that looks like it came out of nature, but it's all in buildings. And
so it already, before he even starts on the cathedral, he's developing a manner of trying to make architecture naturalistic or organic rather than a kind of intrusion. And I guess that that probably comes out of some of these general... He has this kind of secular or even atheistic dissatisfaction with the modern world, where he might see that as an invasion or a colonization of nature. And then he's trying to say there's a better way of thinking of nature. And we in this podcast are always like, yeah, there definitely is. But initially, he kind of doesn't see the really big picture that he's going to. But he's learning to say, look at the natural world and think, now, how is it done? How are structures formed in the creation? What? And in a way, he's listening to the sermon of creation, isn't he? Without fully grasping what he's listening to, but he's being impacted by the divine architect.
And it's something I think we've talked about before, where when the Bible talks about creation preaching to us, it's not that creation gives us the ability to do Greek philosophy and then that is natural theology. So the Bible does sometimes speak about natural theology, but it's never that. It's always look at trees and the sun and look at this sort of thing. That is going to preach an actual sermon to you. Just sort of logic isn't, because actually logic's different for everyone and no one has any wisdom. So Gaudí is someone who actually does. He's probably the only natural theologian we would like, because he's the only one who actually does it the way.
He's actually trying to pay attention to it, and then he's starting to test that with little projects. But what makes him ever start something as absolutely stupendous as this cathedral?
Well, basically, this cathedral, it gets started by this bishop who looks at all these people who are atheists and radicals like Gaudí and thinks, like, we can't be having all this. This used to be a Christian country. We've got to turn things around. A big cathedral will give us this Christian identity and will convert people. And it does, as we've said, like a brilliant idea, and it pays off. So he gets this one Christian architect, but they like fall out and he drops out like less than a year in. So, like, basically no work's been done. And then he just thinks, well, I need some guy. So he just hires Gaudí. And, like, Gaudí realizes later this was, like, strongly the hand of Providence working towards his own salvation. But he's just hired because he's just the guy here. He's kind of Barcelona's best architect. And
he's got new ideas. He's exciting. He's prepared to tackle a big project.
Yeah.
Right?
So he's just hired, basically. He's the only guy left, almost. It's like a fluke of history, but actually,
it's the divine emperor at work.
Yeah. So, yeah, he does that. But even for 10 years into this cathedral project, he still isn't a Christian. But then just as he finishes...
So he's still an atheist while for 10 years building this... building that is this declaration of the worship and reality of God throughout the whole of creation. But he just doesn't believe in this God at all. Yeah. But 10 years in, then what happens?
He finishes this crypt and then he
a crypt?
Yeah.
Right.
And he just suddenly encounters Jesus so strongly. And because obviously he's so intense when you read anything. Because in the post, if you do subscribe and read it, I've got loads of quotations from him. Like most of his hagiography is in his own words.
So let me just explain what PJ's saying there. The Global Church History Project, on the Facebook each day, you get like just a couple of paragraphs where it's a very brief summary. And for some people, that's all they can handle. You know, they're like, that's enough. I'm not, you know, a little glimpse of church history is enough for me. And that is what that's for. But behind each of those, there's like a whole essay. And sometimes it's almost like a mini book. And sometimes there's vast amount of research. I remember this particular one, there was a huge amount of research went into it. And then if you are a subscriber to the Global Church History Project through Patreon, you get free access to all this material, just acres and acres of original research. And with this one, this big body of material, there's loads of quotations from him where he's explaining what he went through and what his vision was and what. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
So he's this very intense person who gives everything. So if you read his quotations, everything, anything he talks about, anything he does, he gives everything to, and he doesn't do any halfway houses. So one of these biographies I quote in it says basically, even just with his politics, like he was this communist who, but then later in life, he becomes this like radical wanting to bring back medieval feudal hierarchy and everything. So he goes from being like, from one end of the political spectrum to the other. He spent no time in the middle. He never does like halfway houses and, you know, that sort of thing. He's always, everything is as intense as it could possibly be. To the point where he's like, well, you used to be able to just cross roads because pedestrians have right of way. So he always refused to look either way when he crossed the road. He was just like, yeah, I have right of way, so I'm not going to give him the... he's just like that. Everything was so intense. If he has a belief, he acts out on it. So as he's building this cathedral, even though he's not a believer yet, he's like, I've got to make it a perfect expression of what I've been hired to do, this theology and, nature kind of expressing its love for Jesus and all this. I've got to study all that. And so he makes this like sermon and this experience of what it's like to come to communion, all in the architecture. And then, so it's like he's preached to himself. But as he says, like a lot of times when people are learning from nature to do architecture, they're cooperating with the creator. So it's like he feels like he's allowed, even before he was a Christian, he allowed Jesus to use him as an instrument. And then Jesus uses himself to preach to himself, his own sort of architecture. So he does, as he finishes this like first bit of the cathedral, and then he's just sort of in it, and he's crafted everything to be this expression of the gospel. He hears the gospel because he knows what he's doing, in a sense. He knows what to listen for. And he's created this amazing presentation of the gospel, and he's the first convert of it. But there are so many over the years who have been. But his life just totally changes. So he was this very decadent person before, and he becomes this incredibly austere sort of person who just, in the end, he just lives in the workshop of the cathedral and lived as like a beggar, and he would go around just asking for funds for the cathedral and all of this. He only ever ate like greens and yogurts and that sort of stuff. Never had any drugs like coffee or alcohol, nothing. He had, very strict on everything. Some people said he didn't even have sugar, but I've seen some people say he did have occasionally. But basically he didn't. And so, he just becomes so intense, but about this. And then he sets up a school. So in Sagrada Familia, he gets a school there, so all the workers can have their kids' education looked after and everything. And then... So there's just loads. His life totally changes.
Yeah, so that's the thing then. He kind of lays this huge foundation from nature, then from actually studying theology. Then he encounters Jesus himself, and then he finally fully understands what it is that he's doing. And then as that develops, the cathedral builds and builds and builds. And then I suppose his heart is ever more in it, not just his mind, but his heart. And it becomes itself not just an embodiment of the way of Jesus in what's going on in the building with helping, education, everything. And so it's this amazing fusion of theological vision, artistic eye, and an encounter with Jesus. And it's one of the fascinating things about the building is that many people have encountered Jesus. Isn't that true? Like, people come to see the tourist attraction, but that they have this experience that he himself had.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an interesting idea he has where he feels like so many people long for Christendom when they're in these old Gothic ruins. And he was thinking, what's that about? And he thinks it's like basically Jesus takes over these bits of architecture and puts his own architecture of trees and branches and stuff, and then it like really comes alive. So he's like, let's just, what Jesus ends up doing with Gothic stuff, let's just do from the outset. And he makes, the whole thing's tuned so that in Gregorian chanting has the perfect acoustics and all of that. So it's all designed to be a proper lived-in church. And so he wants to make sure it doesn't become like so I think it is a UNESCO site or whatever, but he doesn't want it to be that sort of thing where it's just like...
it's so depressing, isn't it? Where a great cathedral just becomes like a National Trust shop and things.
Yeah.
It's so depressing when that happens. And obviously that's not happened. It's still a living place of genuine Christian worship. I get depressed going to cathedrals. That at first I'm excited because I can see the theology that's embedded in it, and then when I'm wandering around, I see what is currently going on in a lot of cathedrals is so like depressingly almost pagan at times. I was in one not long ago, and they literally had all I can describe as a pagan act of worship kind of symbolized in the center. Anyway, he's prevented all that because it's structurally and holistically Christian, and it is still got that living reality of Jesus. And he was trying to build it in such a way that he wanted to speed up the process whereby a building would become like deeply sacred, and saying, let's not wait 500 years for the process. I'm going to build it so that it's fast track to that feeling. And of course, we can think about like something like the Hagia Sophia that was in Constantinople, that was built with that same agenda and with the same effect, wasn't it? When the Russians came in?
Yeah, the baptism of the Rus was one of the best moments in history, and it was a very similar idea, but like based on different nature in a way. It's designed to look like a mountain, the Hagia Sophia. So they've added minarets to it, which ruins this. So if you go now, you don't really get that impression. They've added loads of rubbish to it. But if you sometimes get like an artist's depiction of what it actually looked like as it's supposed to, it does look like a sort of mountain in this sort of area. But it's like a mountain of God. It's like you do feel like you've gone to that mountain
where there's ascend Zion kind of thing.
Where there's the better blood than Abel, or speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. That sort of, you do live that out in the Hagia Sophia because that's the nature around them, and they're able to like make a man-made thing that's like with what Jesus has designed in the rest of the country.
So going with the grain of reality. Like so much of the modern and postmodern world is desperately trying to go against the grain of reality, and therefore everything fails, or it's so pathetic and so depressing, and like we're all stumbling around like reluctant to even exist in such a world. Whereas when you go with the grain of reality, as Gaudi was doing, as Justinian was doing, and so on, how joyful, how like it lifts us up to be part of a society that's been designed, and buildings that have been designed with the grain of reality. Yeah.
And you can imagine being one of those Russ, or being Gaudi himself, when he's in that crypt having this encounter with Jesus, that it's suddenly like all this nature we love paying attention to. And we're thinking, what does it all mean? And then you just see it expressed, like, this is what trees are doing, this is what birds are doing, this is what the sky is doing. You see it expressed properly, and then suddenly it's like all of creation makes sense. If creation alone can do it, but then as we have, we need buildings, we need ordinary life and everything. And then that can warp how we understand nature. We kind of twist nature. We always, because we have like house plants and things, we always put nature where we are. But if our theology is wrong, then we're ruining this message that nature's supposed to be preaching to us. When we understand it, then suddenly it's like all of reality just clicks together, and you get to hear the sermon, perhaps for the first time, like Gaudi did and the Russians did. You do get to hear it, and that's one of the wonderful things with proper Christian architecture.
Well, just quickly tell us the story of the Rus, that they were trying to figure out what's the right way to meet God, did they?
Yeah, and they so then they'd sent people all over the world to different churches. They went to Western Europe, and they felt similarly to Gaudi that I'll actually repeat Gaudi's whole quotation.
Okay.
Because he says, Gothic architecture becomes expressive only in the state of ruin, half covered with weeds and ivy, and contemplated in moonlight or at dusk. So there's a feeling amongst like North Africans, but then especially like Augustine found this sort of European architecture very dark and sad. But loads of Africans.
It's funny that even as it was being built, it was already old.
Yeah. And these Russians felt the same, or the Rus. The East Slavic Confederacy based in Kiev, they felt the same thing about Gothic architecture. They're like, well, this is quite gloomy and sad, or it's Romanesque at the time.
So they thought it's powerful. There's obviously a spiritual reality here. But even as they're building it, it's already old.
Yeah.
It already feels nostalgic.
Yeah, and then they didn't like Islam because they'd have to give up all the nicest food and alcohol and things. And they were just like,
you can't have Russians without a vodka or something.
Yeah. So that was just a no-go. Although I don't think they even particularly appreciated Mosul that much, but I think the no-go was that. And then it was similar things with Judaism. But I think they also found synagogues uninspiring. Like architecture was throughout it all. They were like, mosques aren't it, synagogues aren't it. And they even thought Gothic architecture isn't it. We'll say more positive things about Gothic architecture in another episode.
But, we will, because we do love it. And Gaudi kind of loves it too, doesn't he? But anyway, but the Rus, anyway, they went and looked at all these examples, and whatever pluses and minuses, they weren't convinced.
Yeah. And then the Hagia Sophia, they go in, and they say, when it was nighttime, and the Hagia Sophia, because it's all got this gold all throughout the inside, or it did, and lots of lights, candles and lamps and all sorts of things, so it's just beaming. And they say, as you're sailing towards it, loads of sailors thought, I thought it was midnight, but it looks like it's dawn, because the Hagisphere just looks like a sun. It's this mountain that radiates like the sun, and that alone lets you live through Genesis, when we hear about that mountain where God lives, and Revelation, Ezekiel, where it pops up again. It's like you get to see it. It's been expressed here on earth. So people get that just as you're sailing towards it, and then you can only imagine what it's like once you go in. How bright that light is, and then the singing, as it's all designed to reverberate properly, and it's all, you get caught up in it. And then the incense, you see your prayers going up, and then you see that massive picture of Jesus in the dome looking down from the highest heavens, and he's in charge. That's that icon called Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of everything. He's looking down, he's in charge, and then it's just that way that it's representing the sort of terrain of the area, and a terrain that the Slavs were probably more familiar with. And then just saying, look how it all is under Jesus' control. So then once they leave the building and they look around at mountains and, all the other features represented in this basilica, then they just suddenly are remembered, Jesus is the Pantocrator. And all this authority flows down and reaches even this. So all of this is under his control. And they've just seen that presented beautifully, and so it doesn't leave them. As they leave the building, the message the building left them with, and the perspective on how to properly see creation, didn't leave them. And so they couldn't help but go back to their home territories, or even the countryside on the way back there, and just see everything in this new light with Jesus in control. So that was their conversion. And then after seeing that, they just think that's it. So there's a mass baptism. They go through this river. Everyone has to be baptized. It's like, that's it now.
So it's like, that kind of experience of a building that sets out a Christ-centered cosmic civilization, that's kind of what Gaudi's done in Barcelona. Did he manage to complete it all in his own lifetime?
No, and he said he didn't want it to. He wanted it to be such a big project, there was no way he could see it finished. He wanted it to be the, proverbial tree that's planted that you'll never sit under its shade. He says quite a few, he doesn't say that phrase, that is someone else, but he says a lot of things like that, where it's like, I'm passing this on to future generations, and I've got to, because just the building of it converted him, so he wants lots and lots of people to have exactly his experience, to be building in that workshop where he first met Jesus, and to come to Christ that way, because just the process of building is a converting experience, and he wanted that to be shared with as many people as possible. So he wanted it to be far too big and complex a project, and he also wanted to make sure the workers had it a little easy as well. They weren't being worked to the bone sort of thing, so it wasn't. And they certainly haven't been, because they're still working on it.
Is it still being worked on now? So it's not. It must be mostly complete now.
I think I remember there was a festival where they reached a halfway point or something like that in my lifetime. This was a few years back.
Okay, so it is still going on, and if you go, or if we go, we can still see the vision being formed, and he wanted that. This sense that it's something, just as the ongoing experience that creates a living thing almost, that's still growing and developing, and he wanted that. So what an amazing individual Gaudi was, and he still preaches to us through this incredible building, and it does help us to studying him has helped us even now to get this sense of what cathedrals have always tried to do, and some do it better than others and so on. But this is one of the great ones of the whole world, really, where it's really successfully embodying in architecture this huge vision of Jesus at the center of the cosmic civilization that he reigns over, and that going into such a building, particularly when that building is inhabited by people who believe that, and perform it in liturgy and preach it from the word and live it out in practice. When this building becomes a hub for word and sacrament and life, wow, how amazing that is. And you can see why such buildings had this effect of creating civilizations around them. They became like an engine of civilization for whole areas of countries and things. And that's what has happened for Barcelona in a way, and tourists come, experience it, and go back. That's Gaudí. Amazing. So we were going to cover another person. Who was the other person we were going to cover, but we've run out of time?
Yeah, there's a Chinese martyr, although you'll be able to read about, I'm sure some of you will subscribe and you can read about him without any delay. But there's a Saint Joseph from China, Saint Joseph. I'm working on pronunciation, so some of you will be listening, it's like, that sounds nothing like it. But I'm doing my best. It's Saint Joseph Zhong Da Peng, I think. Something like that.
And he was born in the 18th century and through to the 19th century. And he had not been a Christian, but he was... And this is before there were the sort of Western missionaries that came to China, isn't it? Because people often think about Hudson Taylor and people like that. That was later. But there was... Chinese Christians who were from a Catholic tradition in the main. It had been like that really since 15th century or 14th century.
Or 13th even.
Or even the 13th century.
Montalbano and Marco Polo. He was a great missionary.
Marco Polo, missionary time. So from the 13th century onwards, you had this revival of Christianity in the form of from the Catholic Church. And previous to that, would it be Church of the East? Or
it was a kind of complex setup where people had a lot of the debates that divided churches outside of China didn't seem to divide them at all. And so you had people sharing communion from what we would think of as Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox, or Church of the East and Catholic and more, all just kind of in the same church.
That is awesome vision, isn't it? That they would say, okay, we have slightly different ways of understanding how Jesus was fully divine and fully human, or in these kind of questions. But, we all love him, and he died for us and rose again, so let us feast on his body and blood together, and let's not allow those things to divide us when we should be united in Holy Communion. It's an amazing thing that they experienced that. So, because you would normally say, oh, well, the Oriental Orthodox, Church of the East, Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, it was immensely difficult to get them all to take communion together. They just about managed it as Constantinople fell,
Yeah.
And they always say, oh, wasn't it amazing for just one time we all managed to take communion together just before it was all destroyed. But that's what happened then in China. So that's all that long period. But and it'd be good. Look, we can't do it now. I'm hoping our listeners are like, come on, we want to know more about the history of Christianity in China. Well, you can, like the Global Church History Project has loads of this in-depth essays and studies that cover different characters from Chinese history. We've got Japanese history, there's Koreans, and all sorts of events from church history. And then, although there's little snapshots on Facebook, as we've said, you get whole essays. In fact, for patrons, you get books free. There's literal whole books that are free to use. It's like a massive library. So we wanted to take this episode we were going to do two big saints from church history. The Chinese guy who he was an industrialist, and then Chinese Christians witnessed to him, and then he becomes a Christian and becomes a tremendous evangelist and uses his wealth and power and influence to be a tremendous evangelist, and then people give their lives in order to enable him to keep on working as an evangelist. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. He was absolutely beloved by Christians at the time, and then ever since I think his grave's still there, and people do visit it, go on pilgrimage to see it. So yeah, just an incredibly fruitful ministry.
Yeah. I always remember when, the day when we study him, because you have a distinctive picture of him that I always remember. So we can't do him, though. We've done a little snapshot of him, and he's a wonderful Christian. But what I would say to everyone who's listening, that if you're interested in church history and going much further, like some people, they've done a bit of European church history or a bit of Mediterranean church history. But the whole vision is actually the vast majority of Christians down through the ages all over the world haven't been around the Mediterranean, immediately around the Mediterranean or Western Europe. They've been East in Asia, all across Asia, the Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, everything like that. And then you also cover Western Europe. I know you often give us access on the Global Church History Project. We find out about all kinds of saints, and you often do Welsh saints as well. And I've loved finding out about them. And people in, Protestants, I'll admit to this, can be quite strong on, say, the first 300 years, and then tend to pick up again in the 16th century and suddenly get quite good on church history again. But there's literally 1,200 years where many, many Protestants really hardly know anything at all. Not even about European church history. That's true, I'm afraid. But that, in the Global Church History Project, fills that in too. There's whole aspects of European church history there that get filled in. But anyway, if you want to join that, and it's just for interest sake, if a person wanted to join and said, I haven't got very much money, what's the minimum I would join at to be able to access this big library?
So at £5, you can access every post.
Wow!
So that you
just
do get
£5 a month, and you're into the whole library.
Yeah. Or if you don't want to subscribe because you think that's a lot of commitment, just that we have options for just buying parts of it with bundled some of the posts together, so you can think, I just want to learn about these sorts of saints. We'll have more bundles and stuff. So there's that. There's other ways to pay, and then you can buy the books on Amazon or in the Patreon store, or there's loads of different ways. So check out.
Okay, I love that. I love the books as well, because there's some of the books focus on periods of the church year, and now they come with recipes and all sorts of celebrations and recipes from all over the world. Anyway, look, I leave that with you. I enjoy accessing all these resources. It's had a huge impact on me, and we even try out these recipes in our home and things when we get to these parts of the church year. See what you think, and in the next part of the podcast, we're going to start on this theology of the human body.